Hey, good morning, everyone. We'll start in just a moment. All right, good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to round one of the Gladiator one-on-one competition. My name is Jeff Harkavy. I'll be your judge presiding for this round. We are calling the case of the United States versus Carol Bassett. And scoring attorneys, I'm going to ask you to please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and turn off your audio and video. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means that the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. Is everyone able to hear me all right? If so, please go ahead and wave at me. Okay, good, thank you. All right, so we will have counsel go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask counsel at this time to please make your appearances, starting with the prosecution.
Yes, Your Honor. May we introduce ourselves?
Yes, please.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is William Mueller, and I, alongside with my second chair, Cameron Corkett, represent the government in today's case.
Welcome.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Josiah Jones, and I, along with my second chair, Ms. Tristan Slack, represent Ms. Carol Bassett.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning. Okay, so we will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in the speaker view. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking.
Your Honor?
Okay. Oh, yes.
Is it all right if we go over a few trial matters?
Please go ahead, Mr. Mueller.
Yes, we'd just like to invoke Rule 615, which calls for the constructive sequestration of all witnesses in this case. We'd also like to invoke...
I'm sorry, any objection on that motion by the defense?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, Rule 615 is invoked. Witnesses are constructively sequestered and excluded from the courtroom when they are not testifying.
We'd also like to invoke Rule 603, which calls for the constructive swearing in of all witnesses.
Any objection by invoking that rule, Mr. Jones?
No objection, Your Honor.
So ordered.
And lastly, Your Honor, we'd like to draw the court's attention to a stipulation in this case.
Please go ahead.
Stipulation 6, which states that once exhibits are admitted, both opposing counsel and I can use them at any time during openings, closings, directs, and cross. And furthermore, we'd like to direct the court's attention to Stipulation 7, where it says that exhibits 4 through 33 are pre-admitted, and we can use them at any time.
The court has read those stipulations and understand that, of course, by definition, stipulation, this has been agreed to already by both sides, and the court will honor that. Any further preliminary matters, Mr. Mueller?
No, Your Honor.
Any preliminary matters that you wish to take up, Mr. Jones, before we begin with opening statements?
No, Your Honor, we're ready with opening.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll begin with opening statements, starting with the prosecution. Mr. Mueller, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. Members of the jury, this is Don Clark. He was the owner of the largest elephant zoo in the US, and he lived and worked there with his wife and kids. At first, August 18, 2017 was like any day for Mr. Clark. He walked around the zoo talking to guests. But that day, when he closed up the zoo and said goodbye to guests, he was saying goodbye for the last time. That night, Mr. Clark disappeared. But members of the jury, make no mistake, this isn't a missing persons case. No, this is a murder. Don Clark was murdered by this defendant, his wife, Kara Bassett. Today, you're going to learn that Don Clark was the only problem standing in Miss Bassett's way, so she made him disappear. So we've charged the defendant with murder. Now, we assume the burden to prove to you that Miss Bassett killing her husband is the only reasonable explanation for his disappearance. And we'll meet that burden by answering 3 questions today: what the defendant stood to gain, how the crime was committed, and where it took place. First, what the defendant stood to gain. 6 years before the murder, the defendant and Don Clark got married and opened a zoo. The only problem was they disagreed on how the zoo should be run. So you're going to learn that Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark would argue. That Miss Bassett would go to Mr. Clark, demand that she get what she wanted, but her demands fell on deaf ears. But that all changed with a power of attorney form, essentially a will, that would allow Miss Bassett to access Mr. Clark's assets in the event that he disappeared. Today, you're going to learn that it was Miss Bassett who insisted that clause be added. So all she had to do to take control of the zoo was make Don Clark disappear. We will prove to you today that on August 18th, she took a syringe of elephant tranquilizer, stabbed her husband with it, and just like that, her problem disappeared. That's what she stood to gain. Now we're going to call the lead investigator in this case, an FBI agent named Steph Brown. And she'll tell you that when they searched the zoo after Mr. Clark was reported missing, they found a logbook keeping track of when the park used syringes of elephant tranquilizer. Agent Branham will tell you that according to that logbook, 24 syringes were supposed to be left. But when she searched the park, she only found 23. Today, you're going to learn that it was Miss Bassett who took that syringe and stabbed her husband. That's how this crime was committed. But the defendant, she wasn't out of the clear yet. She still had to make Don Clark's body disappear. See, today, Agent Branham will show you GPS records of a van that was owned by Mr. Clark. And on August 18th, that van was driven from the park to a swamp hundreds of miles away. Agent Branham will tell you it was the defendant who was behind the wheel of that van. And the physical evidence supports this. Agent Branham will tell you that they found mud from that very same swamp on a pair of the defendant's shoes, confirming that she was there that night. It was at that swamp that she made her husband disappear. That's where this crime was committed. Now, members of the jury, I'd understand if you didn't want to believe that this could happen, that a wife could murder her husband. But when people get so caught up in trying to get their way, when they forget their actions have consequences, when they start to think of people in their lives as problems that they need to make disappear, well, that's when tragedies like these happen. Don Clark was the defendant's only problem, and so she made him disappear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Mr. Jones, you may give your opening statement, please.
May I proceed?
Yes, please.
He had to leave. He had to leave right then. It's 6 p.m., August 18th. Don Clark is having a conversation with a friend when he receives a text message from someone in Costa Rica. It's the kind of text message that will make your face turn white. He knows in that moment he has to disappear. He waits until all his park staff is cleared and his wife has gone to sleep. He sends a text of his own, this time to his sleeping wife. I'm going out for a while. But what he leaves out is that I'm never coming back. Members of the jury, meet my client. This is Kara Bassett. She's the woman who had no idea in the middle of the night her husband would just pick up and leave. She's an elephant enthusiast who loves nature and is the proud owner of the baby elephant sanctuary. You're going to learn that she is generous, passionate, ambitious. That's not what you just heard. The government just tried to tell you that my client made Don Clark disappear. But she's that type of person. But they can't just tell you that. They have to prove it to you beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove every single element of the charge that they brought against my client beyond a reasonable doubt. They will fail. They will fail because there is no body, no evidence, and no reason for Don Clark to stay. First, there's no body. The government isn't going to be able to prove to you that Don Clark is actually dead. They won't provide you with an autopsy saying he died of elephant tranquilizer. They won't provide you with an eyewitness account telling you a place and a time where Don Clark died. In fact, you're going to learn that after searching the elephant park, swamp, and the airport, they had no indication that Don Clark was actually dead. Secondly, they have no evidence because they had a faulty investigation. I'm going to get a chance to ask the lead FBI investigator some questions today. And she is going to have to admit to you on the stand that that mud mixture that Mr. Mueller put so much emphasis on during his opening statement, they actually didn't test for it in my client's elephant park, so they won't be able to tell you whether or not that mud mixture was just from the place where she works every single day. Finally, Don Clark had no reason to stay. You're going to learn that Don Clark was in business with some bad people in Costa Rica. And that text that he got on August 18th made him fear for his life. He had already made the financial preparations in case he ever needed to disappear. And you're also going to learn about his ex-wife, Lisa Clark, who had been suing him for money that he allegedly hid and had been threatening him constantly. Members of the jury, Don Clark had to leave, and it had to be right then. We trust that because there is no body, no evidence, and no reason for Don Clark to stay, that you will find that my client is not guilty of murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Okay, before the government calls its first witness, I will ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right-hand portion of your screen. That will allow you to see the witnesses and the attorneys at the same time. Give everyone just a moment to go ahead and do that. All right, at this time, the prosecution may call their witness. Mr. Mueller.
Yes, Your Honor. The government calls Agent Steph Branham to the stand. May I proceed?
Yes, please.
Good morning, Agent Branham.
Good morning.
Agent, feel free to let me know if you can't see me or hear me at any point.
Right now I can see and hear you very clearly. Thank you.
I'd like to start by going over some of your credentials. What's your educational background?
Well, I joined the FBI in 2002 and I went through the standard training in Quantico, Virginia. That's about 20 weeks, 800 hours. We learn about crime scene investigating, interrogation tactics, and proper evidence collection. Every year, I also go through a course of annual training on those same subjects. You see, I'm getting to be 60 years old. I have to make sure I still know what I'm talking about.
And where do you currently work?
For the last 5 years, I've worked at the FBI office in Jacksonville, Florida. I work in the Violent Crimes Unit.
Agent, how did you get involved in this case particularly?
I was the lead investigator into the
During your investigation, did you collect sufficient facts and data?
Yes, I did.
Did you use reliable methods?
Yes, standard in my field.
And did you apply those methods to this case reliably?
That's correct.
Your Honor, pursuant to the rules of this jurisdiction, we tender Agent Branham as an expert in criminal investigation.
Any objection by the defense?
No objection, Your Honor.
The witness is so deemed to be an expert in that field. Thank you.
Right, Agent Branham. Now, this case has a lot of different names and places, so I want to break some things down for the jury. Who is the defendant?
The defendant in today's case is Kara Bassett, then Kara Clark while she was married to Don Clark.
Who exactly is Don Clark?
Don Clark is a resident of Tallahassee, Florida. He was 38 years old when he went missing. He lived there with his wife, Kara Bassett.
Agent, what exactly happened to Don Clark that's led us to be here today?
On August 18th, 2017, Don Clark was never seen or heard from again. In the FBI's investigation, we ruled his case as a homicide.
All right, Agent, now I want to break down the steps in your investigation for the jury.
Sure.
What was your first step?
Our first step was conducting some interviews. We interviewed Ms. Bassett, we interviewed Don Clark's attorneys, we interviewed all the staff at the park, we interviewed some close friends and business colleagues of Don Clark, as well as his children.
I want to talk about that first interview, the one with the defendant. Was Ms. Bassett able to tell you anything about Mr. Clark's disappearance?
When we presented evidence we'd collected against Ms. Bassett, she was never able to give us a clear explanation. She would say, "I don't know," and nervously laugh.
Did she say anything else noteworthy about Mr. Clark or their relationship?
Yes, she did. We found evidence that there was a primary conflict between Ms. Bassett and her husband. You see, they owned an elephant park together, the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. And at the time of his death, they were running it as a zoo, which is a business. But Ms. Bassett tried to convince her husband to change it from a business, a zoo, and to a nonprofit organization known as an animal sanctuary.
Do you know who owns the zoo now?
Right now, Ms. Bassett owns the zoo.
Do you know how she was able to take control of the zoo?
Yes, I do. A few weeks before Don Clark's death, he signed a power of attorney document with his wife.
Are you familiar with Exhibit 15?
Yes,
Is this the power of attorney form you were mentioning?
that's correct. That's Don Clark's power of attorney.
Mr. Corky, could you pull up the highlighted section? What are we looking at here, Agent?
This is the disappearance clause. So if Don Clark died or disappeared, Ms. Bassett could invoke her power of attorney and control all of his finances.
All right, Agent, now I want to take a look at the next step in your investigation. Did you search the park?
Yes, we did.
Did you find any sort of weapon?
No, we didn't find a weapon, but we found a log of the use of elephant tranquilizer, and we found that there was a syringe of elephant tranquilizer missing from the park.
Is this that logbook?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, according to this logbook, how many syringes were supposed to be left according to the last entry?
According to the last entry, about a couple of weeks before Don Clark disappeared, there were supposed to be 24 syringes of elephant tranquilizer left.
How many did you find when you searched the park?
When we searched the park, we were only able to recover 23. That meant that there was one syringe that was missing and unaccounted for.
Were any of the park staffers able to provide you a reason as to how or why a syringe might go missing?
No, not at all. From what we learned talking to the staff and Ms. Bassett, they kept this log very well maintained, very meticulous. Since elephant tranquilizer is a very toxic drug, the park could actually get in some trouble if they didn't keep that well maintained. It would be dangerous.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay?
Counsel wish to respond as to which portion of the statement?
The interviews of the park staffers details about the log.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Respond.
I believe the witness was saying that no statements were made by those park staffers, that they weren't able to provide any explanation as to how the logbook might have gone missing or how or why. And so, Your Honor, we're actually offering this for the opposite reason of hearsay, 801, which is to show that no statement was made.
If I may, Your Honor?
Yes.
The way the agent phrased it, from what we gathered from the interviews of the park staffers, the elephant log, the carfentanil log, they learned that it was meticulous through the interviews of the park staffers. That would be hearsay, that conversation.
Mr. Mueller?
Your Honor, I believe she was just using the effect on the listener, the effect they would have on her investigation and the subsequent action, whether or not she was able, as we expect she'll testify.
So to the extent that the statements were made with regard to how the elephant tranquilizer log was kept, how the inventory of the tranquilizer itself was kept, are you offering those statements for its truth or its effect on the listener?
Solely for the effect on the listener, Your Honor.
Right. In that case, the court will overrule the objection by the defense as to that specific portion of the witness's testimony. However, the statements are not offered to the extent that there is an inference that there were statements made by the park personnel to the witness with regard to the issues involving the tranquilizer. And those statements are, and those inferences are not being offered for their truth, but simply to explain the witness's responses or further actions in her investigation upon receiving that information.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent, did the knowledge that you gained from those interviews affect your investigation at all?
Yes, from what we learned about how the log of elephant tranquilizer was used, that led us to believe that this missing syringe of elephant tranquilizer was used by Miss Bassett to kill her husband.
Right, Agent Branham, let's take a look at the last step in your investigation. You mentioned that Don Clark disappeared. Do you have any idea where he might have gone?
Yes, we do. The evidence we collected led us to believe that after Miss Bassett injected him with elephant tranquilizer, that she dumped his body in a swamp in Florida known as Big Gum Swamp.
Are you familiar with Exhibit 31?
Yes, of course.
What exactly is Exhibit 31?
These are the GPS records of Don Clark's van from the night of the murder.
Where was the van driven?
Well, all day on August 18, 2017, the last day he was seen alive, it was stagnant at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park until 11:17 p.m. At that point, it was driven over 100 miles to the Big Gum Swamp, and it arrived there at 1:26 a.m.
Agent, did you find any physical evidence that can tell us if the defendant was there?
Yes, we did. We collected some physical evidence from the van and did forensics testing on it.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. We did fingerprint testing. We found that Miss Bassett's fingerprints were on the steering wheel of the van. In addition, we gathered some mud samples and algae samples from the swamp, and also algae samples from the gas pedal of the car, as well as samples from Miss Bassett's boots. We found that the algae from the swamp was the same as the algae in the car and on Miss Bassett's boots.
Right, Agent. So in your opinion, what did the defendant stand to gain by committing this crime?
Well, we learned from the power of attorney document that she would gain all control of Don Clark's finances and businesses, so she would have total control of the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. She would have the ability to change it from a zoo into a nonprofit sanctuary.
In your opinion, how was this murder committed?
All the evidence we collected led us to believe that she injected her husband with a lethal elephant tranquilizer. Only a little bit of this drug, the amount that could fit on a tip of a pencil, that could kill an adult.
And finally, Agent Branham, where did this crime take place?
The evidence we collected led us to believe that Don Clark was injected and killed at the park, and then his dead body was dumped at Big Gum Swamp.
Right, Agent. Now, I want to just ask you one last thing.
Sure.
Do you have any evidence to suggest that Mr. Clark just up and left?
No, we don't. In my experience investigating murder, serial murders, and kidnappings, we've learned that in many cases where an adult goes missing, it can be ruled as a homicide. We learned from all the evidence we collected that Don Clark never contacted anyone after his death, and we found no activity on his bank records to indicate that he just up and left.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Mr. Jones, you may cross-examine.
Good afternoon, Agent. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, I can see and hear you very well.
You started your investigation by searching the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, correct?
Yes, I searched that elephant park after he was reported missing.
No, you weren't able to find any blood there, were you?
No, we don't believe there was any blood, as we believe that the evidence collected suggests Don Clark was injected with a poison.
Right, but there was no signs of struggle at the elephant park either, right?
No, we don't believe that there was a struggle in this case.
No signs of violence either?
No.
You also became aware that the chemical carfentanil was present on my client's property, right?
Yes, that's correct. It's an elephant tranquilizer.
Right. This elephant tranquilizer was kept in a separate storage facility from my client's home on the property?
That's correct, but we learned that Miss Bassett would have had access since it was her elephant park.
Is that still a yes? It was kept separate from the home on my client's property?
Yes, that's correct. It has to be kept quite locked up since it's a very toxic drug.
Right. Let me show you what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 19, and you already testified to this today. You recognize it as the carfentanil log, right?
Yes, that's correct.
I want to direct your attention to the indicated portion there. You see the last time that my client accessed the carfentanil, according to the log, was August 1st.
Yes, that's correct. We don't believe Ms. Bassett would record her use of a drug that she killed her husband with, of course.
Objection, Your Honor. The last portion of the answer was non-responsive.
May I be heard, Your Honor? I believe you're on mute, Your Honor.
You had to get unmute. Go ahead. Yes, please respond.
Your Honor, I believe Agent Branham is entitled to a brief response.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. Jones, go ahead.
The last portion of the answer was a brief response. However, the portion after that, indicating whether the FBI's investigation Ms. Bassett would include whether or not she killed her husband with the carfentanil log, that portion of the answer was not responsive.
I'll sustain the objection as to the very last portion of her answer as being non-responsive, and but the rest of the answer will remain in evidence.
Motion to strike that last portion, Your Honor.
Motion to strike just that last portion is granted.
Agent, that August 1st would be 2 weeks prior to Dawn Clark's disappearance, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
I want to turn your attention to the night of August 18th. You became aware throughout the course of your investigation that a text was sent from Dawn Clark's phone to my clients.
That's correct. Right after that text was sent, his SIM card was likely destroyed.
Excuse me, Agent, I didn't hear that last part.
Yes, this was the last text that Dawn Clark ever sent. His cell phone wasn't active afterwards.
This is Exhibit 20. You recognize that?
Yes, I do.
Now, this text said going out for a while, right?
That's correct.
And it was sent to my client's cell phone?
Yes, we found that the exact minute afterwards is when his phone was never heard from again and we couldn't locate it. That indicated to us that his SIM card was likely destroyed at that time.
Right. I want to show you what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 31. Agent, 3 minutes later after that text was sent, that's when the van departs from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
That's correct.
Afterwards, I'm showing you what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 22. Agent, that's an excerpt from the GPS data that you pulled, right?
That's correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Agent, but my client's cell phone pings off the nearest cell tower to the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park at midnight, right?
Well, 12 a.m. of August 18th, 2017, that would be the time that day started. Midnight would have gone into 12 a.m. of August 19th, so no.
Excuse me, Agent, but it does say it was at the park for 168 straight hours starting on that day, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So while the van is en route to the swamp, it stayed at the park.
That's correct.
I want to turn your attention to Costa Rica. You became aware throughout the course of your investigation that Dawn Clark made frequent trips to Costa Rica.
That's correct.
And I'm showing you what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 4. Excuse me, Agent. Sorry, previously admitted as Exhibit 5.
I don't see that exhibit on the screen right now.
1 second, Agent. Technical difficulties.
No problem.
Agent, that's actually an excerpt from Exhibit 4. You recognize that as an excerpt from the letter from Mandy Tuminelli, Dawn Clark's attorney?
Yes, that's correct. We found that Ms. Bassett actually requested the disappearance clause, which was very suspicious to us as the FBI.
As the indicated portion indicates there, the reason that was cited for that disappearance clause was because of those men in Costa Rica, right?
Yes, that's correct, but we didn't find any evidence that there was anyone in Costa Rica that actually wanted to hurt Dawn Clark. We found this to just kind of be a way to explain away Dawn Clark's disappearance on Ms. Bassett's end.
That remains a yes to my question. The reason the disappearance clause was cited was because of those men in Costa Rica.
Yes, that's what Ms. Bassett said, but we did not find any evidence backing up her story on that.
Well, if you look to the end of that indicated portion, Agent, Mr. Clark actually said this clause was fine.
That's correct.
He didn't disagree.
That's correct.
Agent, I want to jump back into your investigation, directing your attention to what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 5. Now, that's an excerpt from your forensics report, right?
That's correct.
Now, that mud mixture you were talking about, the algae, you actually did not test for that algae at my client's elephant park, did you?
Yes, that's correct. You see, when we did the forensics testing on the algae, we actually found that the sample had 2 species. we found that these two species were very unlikely to see together, and that it was highly unlikely that the algae could have been found anywhere but Big Gum Swamp.
Agent, the fact remains that despite the algae being so rare, you can't tell us whether or not it's present at my client's elephant park because you didn't test for it.
We can't tell you for sure, but all the evidence we collected determined that that was highly unlikely.
So that's a yes.
That's correct.
You also didn't test any swamps that may have been closer to my client's elephant park, right?
That's correct. Again, we found that these two species of algae, they were very rare to see together. So the most likely outcome was that it was from Big Gum Swamp. Any other outcome seemed highly unlikely.
But again, you did not test.
That's correct.
I want to turn your attention to Lisa Clark. You became aware of her throughout the course of your investigation.
Yes, we learned about his ex-wife, Lisa Clark.
And Ms. Clark actually didn't cooperate with your investigation fully, did she?
That's correct.
She wouldn't submit to an interview?
That's correct.
She didn't allow you to search her property?
That's correct. We didn't find any compelling evidence that indicated that Lisa Clark actually wanted to hurt Don Clark. We didn't find any physical evidence against her or any evidence that she would have something to gain, like Ms. Bassett.
Well, that remains a yes. She did not allow you to search any of her property.
We didn't have enough evidence to get a warrant to search her property. There wasn't enough compelling evidence against Lisa Clark.
When you asked Ms. Clark to search her property, she told you that Don Clark deserved to die.
That's when we asked her for an interview, and we found that given the amount of evidence we collected, this was most likely just a hyperbole, something angry she said about her ex-husband. Again, we didn't find any compelling evidence that she actually wanted to hurt Don Clark.
That was still a yes to my question. She told you that Don Clark deserved to die.
That's correct.
And finally, Agent, my client cooperated fully with your investigation, right?
That's correct. However, Ms. Bassett wasn't able to give us any explanations for the evidence we collected against her.
She submitted to all the interviews that you requested.
That's correct, but we didn't get any clear answers from her.
Still yes?
She showed up, yes.
She allowed you to search her property.
That's correct.
Agent, your investigation was never able to recover Don Clark's body, was it?
No, again, in my years investigating over 100 cases of kidnappings, it's quite common to rule a case a homicide, even if you don't find a body.
So we don't have any evidence today, like an autopsy, proving that Don Clark died of carfentanil poisoning, do we?
No, again, this is common in my field, and all the evidence pointed that it was the most likely outcome.
We don't have an eyewitness account of Don Clark's death.
No, that's correct, we do not. We believe this crime happened in the middle of the night. There wouldn't be people at a swamp in the middle of the night to witness it.
Agent, there's no eyewitness account, yes or no?
That's correct.
And lastly, Don Clark's van is a shared van with him and Kara Clark, right? Kara Bassett, excuse me.
That's correct.
So the fingerprints you found of Kara Bassett, those reasonably would have been there because she usually operates the van.
Yes, that's why we didn't solely rely on the fingerprints. We had a lot of other evidence that led us to believe Ms. Bassett committed the crime. The fingerprints were just like a cherry on top.
Thank you. Your Honor, nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Any redirect examination, Mr. Mueller?
Yes, Your Honor, brief redirect.
You proceed.
Agent Branham, how sure are you that the mud on the defendant's boots was from the swamp?
Incredibly sure. Like I said, the two species of algae we found in the sample of the mud, they are very rare to see together. And considering the evidence that Ms. Bassett drove the van to Big Gum Swamp, considering the GPS records, it is highly unlikely that the algae could have come from anywhere else. You see, when you're an FBI investigator, you can't hunt down every single swamp and lake and ocean and test the algae. You gather the evidence that you can collect, and you make the most reasonable conclusion. And our conclusion that it was highly unlikely this algae could have come from anywhere else.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Any recross examination, Mr. Jones?
No, Your Honor, no recross.
All right, thank you. So this witness is excused. Thank you, Agent. Any further evidence or witnesses from the prosecution?
No, Your Honor, the government rests.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, you may call your witness.
The defense calls Joe Young to the stand. May I proceed?
Yes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Young.
Good morning.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a filmmaker. Mostly I work on documentaries and reality television.
How did you get into filmmaking?
Well, in high school, I was real big into acting, musicals, plays, and stuff like that. But my mom told me that I had more of a radio face. So I applied to film school and have been working behind the camera ever since, sir.
Did your work behind the camera ever lead you to my client, Kara Bassett?
Yes, it did. In 2015, I was hired by Miss Bassett to shoot a documentary about her elephant park. It was a pretty interesting experience.
How often would you be at my client's elephant park?
I was at the park 5 days a week for about 2 years.
Could you describe my client for the members of the jury?
She was pretty passionate. She talked a lot about elephants, really enjoyed that. She was nice to work with.
Did you also become familiar with Don Clark, her husband at the time?
Yes, I did. I miss him every day. He was a great guy, a really sharp businessman, but he knew how to have fun when the business hours were over.
Were you able to observe the interactions between Don and Kara Clark at the time?
I'm sorry, sir. The audio cut out a little bit. Could you repeat yourself?
Were you able to observe the interactions between Don and Kara Clark at the time?
Yes, I was able to observe those actions.
What did you see? Could you describe their relationship for us?
Yeah, it seemed normal to me. I mean, Don would get Kara lots of gifts, dote on her. She would tease him, just normal relationship stuff.
I want to turn your attention to the afternoon of August 18th. Do you recall that day?
Yes, like most days I was working at the park, just shooting some footage.
Were you around my client?
Yes, that was one of the days where I primarily focused with Miss Bassett. I would sort of alternate who I was with each day, and I was with her that day.
I want to show you what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 21.
All right.
Mr. Young, have you ever seen these before?
Yes, I had an interview on the 64 Minutes TV show. I was shown those documents there.
Ms. Slack, can we actually get the phone call log up on the screen? Sorry about that. My apologies. Mr. Young, do you recall hearing a conversation between Kara Clark and Don Clark around midday?
Yes, although I only heard Miss Bassett's side of or I guess she was Miss Clark then, her side of the phone call.
What did you hear from that phone call?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for hearsay.
Mr. Jones?
Yes, Your Honor. This question will have hearsay in it. However, we will be offering it not for the truth of the matter asserted, but for the effect on the listener. As we get to the statement, it will be clear that it would elicit to Don Clark that Kara Bassett would actually be none the wiser if Don Clark were to just pick up and leave. She would be thinking he would be in Costa Rica just like any other trip.
All right, can you give the court an offer of proof as to if this is not being offered for its truth, how it will be relevant in terms of what you expect the witness to say and if permitted to answer the question?
Yes, Your Honor. I expect that the witness will tell you that Kara Bassett's statement was that she doesn't mind if Don Clark goes on a trip to Costa Rica. That statement in itself was not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. We're going to offer it for the effect on Don Clark, communicating it to him that Kara Bassett would not know or be aware that he had just picked up and left because she would think he was going to Costa Rica like any other normal business trip.
And she was on the phone with Don Clark at the time?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness did testify to that.
Okay. Mr. Mueller.
Yes, Your Honor. If opposing counsel is going to offer this statement not for the truth of the matter asserted, but instead for its effect on a listener, the effect, has to be relevant. Whether or not Ms. Bassett was fine with Mr. Clark ever taking a trip to Costa Rica makes no fact of Don Clark's murder more or less likely to be true.
Yes, Your Honor, if I may.
Yes.
It makes it more likely that Don Clark would reasonably disappear. As I mentioned during my opening statement, he had no reason to stay because Kara Bassett would be financially stable, making it easy for him to go and flee and get away from the danger he was facing from the men in Costa Rica.
All right, thank you to both counsel for your arguments. It's a close call because as far as the issue of effect on the listener, we don't know what, if any, effect there was on the listener because we don't have the listener, of course. But it would be, it has, it has some relevancy. It goes more to the weight versus the admissibility. So the objection on hearsay is overruled. The statement is not offered for its truth, but limited only to the possible effect on listener, and the jurors will be instructed to give whatever weight that they choose to give to that testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Young, we were talking about that phone call midday. Do you recall hearing any statements during that phone call?
Yes, and again, I only heard Miss Bassett's side, but she said something to the effect of, sweetheart, I don't care if you're going somewhere, that's fine.
I want to turn your attention to later on that day. Did you have a conversation with Don Clark?
Yes, at the end of the day, I was about to head out. I was flying to Mexico to work on a nature documentary down there, but we talked for a bit.
Around what time was that, Mr. Young?
Towards the end of my day, so probably around 6 o'clock.
Show you again what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 21. Mr. Young, have you seen that before?
Yes, like I said earlier, I saw it in that TV interview.
Did anything unusual happen during that conversation while you were talking to Don Clark?
Well, like it shows, I believe it's call 7 on that log, he got a text message from someone, and he looked down at it, and like all the color like was sucked out of his face. It turned white, and he told me that he had to take that call. That was the last time.
Excuse me, Mr. Young, sorry about that. Go ahead and finish your answer.
No problem. I was just saying that that was the last thing I heard from Mr. Clark.
Mr. Young, can you see based on that phone log, who is that call from?
It says that it's from an unlisted number in San Jose, Costa Rica.
I want to talk to you about the FBI's investigation. After you got back from that trip in Mexico you just mentioned, did you witness the FBI's investigation of the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park?
Yeah, I got back to the park and I was concerned for a second. I was used to filming a nature documentary and now it looked like I was on an episode of CSI.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, there were FBI agents everywhere. It was crazy.
Mr. Young, did you see anything specific that stuck out to you during the FBI's investigation?
Yes, they were working with these syringes of elephant tranquilizer that they have on the park. Someone was handling one without gloves.
And show you what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 18. Mr. Young, is that one of the syringes you were just talking about?
Looks like it, yes.
Did you also, was there anything else throughout the FBI's investigation that alarmed you?
I'm not sure if it alarmed me, but I did note that that a couple of the park employees weren't interviewed. I didn't see them get interviewed and they complained about it to me.
Were you ever interviewed?
Barely. They barely asked me anything.
Remind us, Mr. Young, how long had you been working at the park by this time?
By that time, I started in 2015, so I'd been working there about 2 years.
How many hours of film, roughly, if you remember, had you recorded up to that?
I had about 2,000 hours of footage. It sounds like a lot since such little amount's going to get used on the documentary, but you have to get a lot so you can cut it down.
Did the FBI ever request to see that footage?
No, they didn't.
I want to turn your attention to a woman named Lisa Clark. During your time at the Elephant Park, did you ever become familiar with her?
Yeah. Let's just say that Lisa's going to make for some very good television.
Mr. Young, what do you mean?
Well, Don and Kara had more of a typical husband and wife relationship like I told you about earlier. Lisa and Don's relationship, well, it was more like something you'd see on Keeping Up with the Kardashians.
Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, Lisa was Don's ex-wife, and she would come to the park sometimes and start screaming at him.
Do you recall any of the specific things Miss Clark would say to Don Clark?
I do. There's one that sticks out in my head particularly. She said, I will wipe you off the face of the earth.
Mr. Young, I want to turn your attention to, I want to direct you to what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 33.
Okay.
Mr. Young, have you seen that before?
Yes, that's Don's obituary.
I want to turn you to the indicated portion there. Were you aware of any legal situation that was going on between between Lisa and Don Clark?
Yes, Lisa was suing Don for $2 million. It was something about alimony or something in their divorce hearing.
How long had she been suing him?
It looks like 2 years at the time of his disappearance.
Mr. Young, we've heard some evidence today. Excuse me, I want to direct you to what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 29.
Okay.
Have you seen those boots before?
Yeah, those are Kara's boots.
Were they normally this dirty?
I mean, we worked at an elephant park. It wasn't like a hospital or restaurant. They didn't have a cleaning crew. So yeah, they were pretty dirty.
Mr. Young, the government has alleged that my client poisoned her husband and dumped him in a swamp. Is that consistent with the Kara Bassett you know?
No, absolutely not. She was a nice person.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Your Honor, nothing further.
Thank you. Cross-examination, Mr. Mueller.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Young.
Good morning, sir.
Mr. Young, you knew the defendant pretty well, wouldn't you say?
I would say so. I worked with her for quite some time.
Right, you spent a lot of time with her at the park, isn't that true?
Yeah, like I told Mr. Jones, I was there 5 days a week.
And you know that Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark, well, they ran an elephant zoo, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you know that Miss Bassett, she really liked elephants, right?
Oh my gosh, she loved elephants. It was insane.
Right, a lot of what she owned was elephant themed, right?
Yeah, she had like this elephant Roomba, one of those things that cleans the floor. She put like a little toy elephant on it. It was obnoxious.
Mr. Corky, could you just quickly flip through exhibits 10 through 14? Mr. Young, that's just a tiny fraction of Miss Bassett's elephant collection, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it is. You saw that Roomba there. I'm glad they got a picture of it.
Now, Miss Young, you met with the defendant for the first time in 2015, right?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
You discussed the documentary, right?
Yeah, we decided to call it The Elephant Queen.
And Miss Bassett told you that one day this will be the largest elephant sanctuary in the world. Isn't that true?
That's right. Like I said, she was pretty ambitious.
Right, that was in 2015, right?
Yes, that's right.
So you would agree with me that even that 2 years before Mr. Clark's disappearance, she was planning to turn the zoo into a sanctuary.
Yeah, Don and Kara talked about it a couple of times.
Now, Mr. Young, you'd agree with me that Mr. Clark, from what you could tell, he saw the zoo more as a business, right?
Yeah, he was a big business guy.
But like we've been talking about, Miss Bassett, she really wanted it to be a sanctuary.
Objection, Your Honor. The question calls for speculation.
Have you heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
Under Rule 701, I'm just asking for the witness's perception. He testified that he knows Kara Bassett very well, that he was at the park with her every day for several years. Certainly he can tell us whether or not she wanted the zoo to be a sanctuary or not, based on his conversations with her and his time spent with her.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. Jones.
If that's the case, then the phrasing of the question need not ask what Miss Bassett actually wanted. It needs to just ask what Mr. Young's perception of the Elephant Park desire on behalf of Miss Bassett was.
Any objection, Mr. Mueller, to just rephrasing your question?
No, I can rephrase.
All right.
Motion to strike any answer that was given to that question.
It will be stricken, but Mr. Mueller, you may ask the follow-up question.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Young, specifically, Miss Bassett told you that she wanted to turn the zoo into a sanctuary.
That's right. That's what she told me.
Right, Mr. Young. Now, you'd agree with me that you actually saw the defendant and Don Clark get into a couple of arguments, right?
Yeah, in the couple of years I saw with them, they got into a few spouts, just like every husband and wife.
They got into some arguments over how the zoo was being run, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it wasn't the kind of arguments that made for great TV, mostly business stuff, but you're right.
Right, one time Miss Bassett, she got so angry, she threw a vase at Mr. Clark's head, wouldn't you say?
I'm not sure if she meant for it to go at his head, but she did throw a vase, that's right.
To clarify, that's yes, she threw a vase in the general direction of his head.
That's right.
Mr. Young, she had you delete the footage of every single fight that they had, isn't that true?
That's right. Our documentary focused more on the elephant park, not on their personal relationship.
You mentioned those 2,000 hours of footage on direct examination, right?
Yes, that's true.
Out of those 2,000 hours of footage, she had you delete every single argument that they would have.
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Have you heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
I was just clarifying what the witness's previous response was.
I think he's given the answer already that that at her direction, he deleted the arguments they had from any footage that he obtained. So I believe it has been asked and answered. So I'll sustain the objection.
Certainly, Your Honor. I'll move on. Mr. Young, you recorded some interviews with the defendant, right?
Yes, we did a lot of those interview shots. And when you're making a documentary, it's important to know people's motivations.
Right. You recognize Exhibit 38, right? That's one of those interviews?
Yes,
If I played it for you, you'd recognize it?
of course.
Looking at the screen right now, does it look like a fair and accurate copy?
Looks like it.
Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 38 into evidence.
No objections from the defense, Your Honor.
Exhibit 38 is received into evidence without objection.
Mr. Corky, could you play the video for the jury?
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Mr. Young, that interview, it was filmed in June 2017, wouldn't you say?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
You'd also agree with me that that is 2 months before Mr. Clark's disappearance?
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Thank you. Any redirect examination, Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, Your Honor. Yes, brief redirect.
Okay.
Mr. Jones, I feel your tech problems. That's the hardest part for me when working on these TV
Yeah,
shows.
I'm right there with all of you.
May I proceed?
Yes, please.
Mr. Young, I just want to address Mr. Mueller's comments about the fights Kara Bassett and Don Clark had.
Okay.
From what you saw, was it a normal relationship?
Seemed like it, yeah.
Were these fights anything that they couldn't handle?
Not to my knowledge, they seem fine.
Thank you, Mr. Young. No further questions, Your Honor. May this witness please step down?
Let me first ask Mr. Mueller if he has any recross based upon the redirect.
No recross, Your Honor.
Without any recross, yes, witness is excused. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank
Any
you.
further witness or evidence for a from the defense?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests.
Thank you. We will now hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Also, since both witnesses have completed their testimony, you can complete the witness portion of your ballots. That's a direction to our scoring jurors. Give us a moment to do that. All right, we will begin with closing argument from the prosecution.
Yes, Your Honor. But before I begin, can I just request that any remaining time I have be reserved for rebuttal?
Yes.
May it please the court? I will take people to their grave. I will do anything to protect these elephants. That's what the defendant said without hesitation during a recorded interview. If I had to choose just one piece of evidence for you to take back to the jury room, I'd give you that quote. Because when we add in that quote, that motive to the events of this case, Mr. Clark's mysterious disappearance, the missing syringe, the mud on the defendant's boots, we realize that these can't just be isolated incidents. No, they're a pattern of events that show us exactly what happened to Mr. Clark and who's responsible. The defendant thought that Don Clark was mistreating the animals, and so she took him to his grave. The defendant made her only problem disappear. At the start of this trial, I told you we'd meet our burden by answering three important questions: what the defendant stood to gain, how the crime was committed, and where. So I want to walk through those with you. First, what the defendant stood to gain. See, today you learned that Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark, well, they just didn't see eye to eye on how the zoo was being run. You learned that they would have arguments. You learned that Miss Bassett one time got so angry she threw a vase at Mr. Clark's head. She was recorded making that statement, saying that she'll take people to their grave if they mistreat the animals. But members of the jury, despite the defendant's passion for the zoo and wanting to turn it into a sanctuary, well, Don Clark just wouldn't listen. But that all changed with a power of attorney form, the power of attorney form that Agent Branham told you about. Essentially, it's a will. And you learned about a disappearance clause. You learned that Miss Bassett insisted that clause be added, meaning that in the event of a disappearance, Miss Bassett would be able to take control of the zoo. That's what she stood to gain. Next, how the crime was committed. Agent Branham told you that when searching the park, they found a logbook keeping track of when the park used syringes of elephant tranquilizer. She told you that according to that logbook, 24 syringes were supposed to be left. But you learned that 23, when they searched the park, they only found 23. Members of the jury, the defense wasn't able to provide you a witness that could say, or a park employee that could say, oh yeah, we lose those syringes all the time. It's totally normal for one to go missing. Members of the jury, they couldn't bring you a witness to say that because that's just not what happened. It was the defendant who took that syringe and stabbed Don Clark. That's how this crime was committed. What about where this crime was committed? Agent Branham showed you the GPS records of a van. And on August 18, 2017, that van was driven 139 miles from the park to a swamp. Members of the jury, the defense also wasn't able to tell you why that might be the case. Why Mr. Don Clark or Miss Bassett would drive to a swamp. Opposing counsels come before you try to talk about Costa Rica, but they haven't been able to give you an explanation as to why Mr. Clark would drive to a swamp at 2 a.m. in the morning. It's not normal to do that, but then again, members of the jury, what this defendant did isn't exactly normal either. She drove that van to the swamp and dumped Don Clark's body. And the physical evidence supports this. See, Agent Branham told you that mud on a pair of the defendant's shoes was found at that very same swamp, meaning she was there that night. The defense, they can try and cloud your judgment. They can try and lie about the defendant's whereabouts that night, but the physical evidence doesn't. It was at that swamp that she made her husband disappear. See, by answering those questions, we've met our burden of proof. When you go back to the jury room, it's your job to assess the evidence both sides have brought you and determine whether or not you have any doubts that are reasonable. Now, this might be your first time on a jury, and you might not know where to draw the line between doubt and reasonable doubt. So I want to walk through that with you. Today, the defense has come before you and tried to say that Don Clark just up and left one night. Members of the jury, think back to my direct examination of Agent Branham. I asked Agent Branham, well, is there any evidence that shows that was the case? That shows that Don Clark just got up one night, decided to leave to Costa Rica? And she said no. She says there's no evidence that that's the case. In fact, all the evidence, all the physical evidence, all the testimony she heard led her to believe that Miss Bassett committed this crime. So when you go back to the jury room and you're looking for reasonable doubt, you can consider their claim that that Mr. Clark up and left one evening unreasonable. See, members of the jury, we've proven our case beyond all reasonable doubt. Everything the defense has given you, it's just doubt beyond all reason. Members of the jury, the defendant may have been able to take that syringe, stab her husband with it, and make her problem disappear. She may have been able to make her husband disappear, but here in trial today, this is one problem she can't just make disappear. Ladies and gentlemen, it's you who decides the verdict in today's case. And I'm confident that after reviewing the evidence, you'll find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Closing argument from the defense.
May I proceed?
Please.
Government has told you an exciting story. That's all it's been. Exciting story. They haven't provided you with the evidence to prove their claims beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Mueller just got up here and told you that he answered all the questions, left you with no reasonable doubt. Well, let's go through exactly what they presented today. First, let's talk about the power of attorney. Yes, my client did have power of attorney over Don Clark. What Mr. Mueller failed to tell you was that Don Clark was right there when that disappearance clause was cited, and he was okay with them putting in there that it was because of the Costa Rican men. The Costa Rican people that Don Clark was working with caused him to be in danger and in fear of his life. Secondly, they told you about that van. They told you my client's fingerprints were on the van, so she must have been the one to drive it to the Big Gum Swamp. What they failed to tell you was that this was actually a shared van between my client, Don Clark, and several of the park staff. It's reasonable for her fingerprints to be on the van. She didn't have to be the one driving to the Big Gum Swamp. Those fingerprints were there every single day. What about the mud? Mr. Mueller has made it a point that my client had to be at the Big Gum Swamp because the mud was on the bottom of her boots. Again, what did they fail to mention to you? The FBI did not test for that algae at my client's elephant park. So they can't tell you whether or not that algae was there because of the place she's working at every single day, or because she actually went to the swamp. They don't know because they didn't test for it. Finally, they told you about, the defense has provided you with a reasonable interpretation of the evidence today. When you're presented with two reasonable interpretations of the evidence, you must find in favor of my client. So let's look at that reasonable interpretation. Don Clark had to leave. You heard about the text message that he got from the people in Costa Rica. You heard that his face went colorless from Joe Young, and he ran off to deal with it. Don Clark was in fear for his life, so he made a plan. He made a plan to get out of the city, get out of the country, do whatever he had to do to get away and make sure he was safe. He sent that text to his wife saying he was going out, never telling her that he was never coming back. Members of the jury, Joe Young told you about the lack of evidence in today's case because of the FBI's investigation. He told you that the FBI mishandled some of those syringes. The reason that one of them was missing and unaccounted for was not because my client snuck in there on August 18th to stab her husband. The FBI mishandled that evidence, and they can't tell you where that syringe is because they have it unaccounted. They don't know. Secondly, Don Clark had no reason to stay. You heard that he made the financial preparations necessary in case he ever needed to disappear. He saw this happening. He knew that the people in Costa Rica were a danger to him. So he made that preparation beforehand. You also heard about Lisa Clark, who was constantly threatening Don Clark and suing him for money that he didn't have. In no way was Don Clark able to stay at that place any longer. Finally, the government hasn't proven to you the most basic element of the charges they brought against my client. They haven't proven to you that Don Clark died. Members of the jury, you haven't seen an autopsy proving that Don Clark died of carfentanil poisoning. You haven't seen an eyewitness account saying Don Clark died at this place and at this time. After all their searches, after the government's entire investigation, they were unable to find Don Clark's body. Why? Because he just left. Miss Bassett had no idea that he was going to leave. Don't blame her for Mr. Clark's non-communication. Miss Bassett is not guilty of murder. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, rebuttal by the prosecution.
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, can I just inquire the timekeepers as to how much time I have left?
Of course.
You have 1 minute and 13 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Corkett. Members of the jury, I can't help but notice that by the defense asking you to believe that Mr. Clark just left the zoo himself, they're also asking you to make some interesting choices. They're asking you to choose to believe that all the other events of this case are just coincidences. It's just a coincidence that mud from that very same swamp was found on a pair of the defendant's shoes. It's just a coincidence she was recorded making that statement, saying that she'll take people to their grave, that she'll do anything to protect those elephants. It's just a coincidence that the day Mr. Clark went missing, a syringe did too. But members of the jury, when you hear evidence upon evidence, tying back to one thing and one person, the defendant, these things stop being coincidences and they become proof. Proof that it was the defendant who's responsible for Don Clark's disappearance. And proof that you've got to find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. I need to inquire of counsel because of the different competitions I judge, we have different rules. Is rebuttal permitted by the defense under the rules of Gladiator?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, just want to double check. All right. Everyone unmute yourselves and give yourselves a big